Hello and welcome to the session where we will be looking at configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services, which ties into the AZ-801 certification and Microsoft training. My name is Adnan Hendricks. I'm a cloud solutions architect, technical trainer, and trusted cloud advisor to my clients. You can follow me at MicroSpecialist on Twitter and other social media channels and LinkedIn for more technical training sessions. There's so much content in the AZ-801 that I chose some of the main advanced hybrid services. This is also my follow-up session from the AZ-800 I held a few months ago. You can find it on YouTube and StarTel to review that session. So this session objective, why I came up with the session, is to show some of the features you can configure for advanced hybrid services in a Windows Server hybrid environment with Azure. This is part of the exam requirements along with the AZ-800 exam to gain the Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate certification. So you actually need to earn both exams to get the certification. Also, the focus of this course and certification is directed to running Windows Infrastructure as a Service environments in a hybrid environment with Azure. And these are just some of the benefits of having a hybrid environment. You have more control, so you can maintain private infrastructure for sensitive assets that you don't want to have running on Azure or public cloud. You have the flexibility to use additional cloud resources when needed. So only paying for the actual resources, and also have the ability to scale to the cloud when needed. So it's very cost effective as well. And the ease of use. You can transition in your own time and only take the workloads that you really need to run in the cloud or services. Now, the agenda for the session is really just the focus or objective domains for the AZ-801, which is security or securing both Windows Server on-premises and hybrid infrastructures. So also infrastructure, virtual machines running on Azure, implementing and managing Windows Server high availability. So high availability is the next step. Disaster recovery. So whole business continuity, disaster recovery, your BCDR implementation plan, migrating service and workloads. So later we'll look at how we can use things like Azure Migrate or migrate existing features and functionality within Windows Server to new servers or virtual machines. And then lastly, monitoring and troubleshooting Windows Server environments. So these are Windows Server environments running either on premises or within Azure as virtual machines. Now, I don't have to remind you of how important or prevalent security incidents, they cover the news almost on a daily basis. So security is the main focus. So under the security objective domain, we will be looking at securing Windows Server OS, securing Active Directory in a hybrid infrastructure, looking at how to identify and remediate security issues with Azure services. And this could be things like running Windows Defender, looking at networking, troubleshooting and analysis, securing Windows Server networking and also storage. So this is really the most important focus for everybody right now. And the main view that Microsoft has in security is protecting identities and endpoints. So under the Windows Server operating system security, we're looking at exploits or threat protection through built-in security app. You also need to understand how to configure and manage things like Windows Defender application control, Windows Defender for endpoint, and also Defender Credential Guard, and things like Smart Screen And basically, some of these are existing security products that already exist within Windows Server and also Windows Client. And also, if you're using group policy, all the different ways you can implement OS security by using group policy, etc. So when looking at securing hybrid Active Directory infrastructure, some of the basic Active Directory and network infra security features you should actually already be deploying within your organization. So think about things like password policies or password block lists that you can use, having specific groups or users in the protected users group, implementing Active Directory security by setting up read-only domain controllers and also hardening your domain controllers. So this course, the AZ-801, really covers a lot of existing Windows Server specific controls and setting up restricting access to domain controllers. So basically a lot of the existing things, and then also how you would implement and manage things like Microsoft Defender for Identity to protect your identities against advanced threats using the Defender product that will tie in. And this product uses artificial intelligence and evaluates sign-ins and authorizations and also authentications based on risk levels and also location. And with these things, you can specify where an account is either allowed or has, through one of the controls, not been granted access. So a lot of these hybrid Active Directory infrastructure controls, when looking at securing Windows Server networking, things like setting up firewalls, implementing Windows Server firewall application controls, allowing only specific applications and services through either the network firewall or the client and server firewall. So understanding how to make those exclusions. One of the important things when especially dealing with infrastructure as a service, virtual machines on Azure, and implementing connection security rules, such as network security groups, where you can specify specific ports to allow through or on the network different kinds of communication. One of the main features that existed for quite some time within Active Directory is implementing domain isolation, allowing only specific clients to access specific servers or other clients or domains. One of the further security issues or topics to understand and utilize is using Azure services for service security. And this is the Microsoft Defender for Cloud, previously used or known as Security Center, where you can evaluate security settings, configuration, and also specify and remediate those security breaches. Microsoft Sentinel, a SIEM product that you can utilize that gathers all these different signals. So all the signals from Defender for Cloud and the rest of the security network and Defender products like Endpoint, Defender for Office, etc. It will gather all these signals and you can act on them. Now I've added some screenshots. It's really just a cloud native SIEM. You set up a workspace where it will collect the data. So it gathers all that signals and data from the different products, your networks, your endpoints, etc. You create security alerts based on the different threats, and you can automate and orchestrate depending on the type of threat that gets discovered. So within Sentinel, you can set up a workspace, and all the signals will be sent to the workspace. And once the data is in, you can evaluate all of the signals that's coming from the different data sources. And depending on the type of attack or threat, you will be notified based on the type of threat or exploit. Also the data source where it's been acted on. As you can see from my screenshot, you have Azure AD, so maybe it's a suspicious application or sign-in from a user from a specific device that's triggered a specific security event. And based on all this information, you can also go do some threat hunting or have analytics rules. For example, you can have specific rule logic applied that can search on specific security events that you can auto remediate on. So depending on whether you set up an alert, you can remediate with alert automation. So whenever that alert is triggered, it will go and automate whatever you have set in place in the incident automation. For example, in my screenshot, an incident is created, rule severity is changed, and a playbook is run to remediate the threat and also assign to a specific owner to evaluate on that threat. And these rules will run on a schedule or get triggered. Lastly, securing Windows Server storage. And under Windows Server storage, think of things like managing Windows BitLocker. So drive encryption, you have it on Windows Client for the disks and also Windows Server. For infrastructure virtual machines on Azure, you can also enable Azure disk encryption. The nice thing about Azure disk encryption, you can also save that to Azure Key Vault. You can also manage and recover encrypted volumes and manage the encryption keys, like I mentioned, within Azure Key Vault for your Azure Infrastructure as a Service VMs. So this brings me to my first demo. So I'm just gonna escape and go straight to my Azure subscription. So under networking security, think in terms of virtual networks. So within virtual networks, we have, let me go to some of my virtual machines. So whenever you have infrastructure as a service virtual machines that basically reside on a virtual network, and the whole idea about network security groups is that you have you only want to allow specific communication within that network, subnet, or segment. So for example, looking at this virtual machine, it's on the specific network. I've got the network security groups, and one of the inbound port rules that's been enabled is set with a lower priority than the existing priorities for the other rules, setting the port for RDP open to allow me to connect to this virtual machine from across internet. So some of the default rules or inbound port rules that you normally get on the network security group is from 65,000, 65,001, and 65,500. The first one is allow VNet inbound, allow Azure load balancer, and also the last one is deny all inbound. So the last rule is always a deny, and whatever rules you want to have allowed within that segment, network segment or subnet, is a lower priority than the deny. The same thing, I can have outbound port rules and specify a specific communication on the network that I want to not allow. So I can also add more port rules based on the specific application, etc. So there's a number of ways in which you can apply this through the Azure portal. through CLI, PowerShell, command line, etc. So one of the main, one of the best security features is the Defender for Cloud. And the nice thing about it is that it will basically evaluate all my infrastructure running on Azure based on the virtual machines and the different workloads that I have. It will give me information on my security posture. So where it will say, well, you have a secure score based on a number of recommendations and security controls across my different subscriptions. And some of the recommendations it will give, for example, I've let some of the default like enable MFA need to do. I have to enable auditing, things like adaptive application controls, and some of the recommendations that I have to do, like secure management ports. And the nice thing is it will just allow me to take me to the information on how to set that up within my infrastructure. And sometimes it will give me the option to follow the how to, or just to trigger a logic app, or to immediately click on a button and secure my workload. So that's one of the best features within Azure. Another thing that is included is auto manage. So the nice thing about auto manage is I can set up best practice baselines that will discover, onboard, configure, and monitor my infrastructure. So all the virtual machines, and make sure that they have the right security baseline. Also allowing them to patch using update management, etc. And this is not only for my infrastructure in Azure, but because we're looking at hybrid advanced environments through Azure Arc, I can also enable this to my servers that I've onboarded. For example, this server is running locally at home here with me and not in Azure. And I can also enable all these different capabilities like update management, monitoring, security, and also change tracking and inventory for that. So by utilizing the same Defender for Cloud application that's protecting my cloud workloads. So some of the recommendations I should be following. Remember, this is just a demo. And I thought I would just show you a subset of the security controls. So back to my session. Like I said, there's just so much information within the AZ-801, and we only have an hour to discuss. So looking at the next step, which is high availability. Now, most of the high availability features or core workloads that are run on Windows Server. So I'm basically running Windows Server 2022, but even in Server 2019, 2016, older server versions, you can implement things like failover clustering, implementing high availability of Windows Server virtual machines, and also especially file server high availability if you utilizing scale out file servers and just want to increase your uptime or high availability of those data. So how you would implement a Windows Server failover cluster, looking at on-premises, hybrid, or cloud only, where you can stretch your cluster across different Azure regions or across different data centers. Now, ideally, it is smarter to use an Azure region, for example, because then you don't have to deal with a physical location, and also things like scaling out to the cloud gives you that flexibility, and you get the storage and also performance that you need whenever you need it. So it's almost instantaneous. You can just sign up and have exponential amount of storage and compute. So you can configure your storage, things like modifying QRAM, setting up on Azure Witness, and implementing load balancing. So whenever your cluster is down, your workloads will be failover to the different region. Managing failover clustering, looking at implementing cluster-aware updating, so rolling cluster updating of cluster nodes. You can failover workloads between nodes, install Windows updates on cluster nodes with the cluster-aware updating, and just manage all this using the Windows Admin Center. Some of the features for storage spaces direct. This way you can create a failover cluster utilizing storage spaces direct, where you can implement things like networking, set up storage spaces, different volumes. When looking at business continuity and disaster recovery, disaster recovery basically focuses mainly on things within Windows Server that has a Hyper-V requirement. So this is where you can look at things. If you are running Hyper-V, you can set up Hyper-V replicas, where you can replicate virtual machine workloads to different data centers in case something, in case of a failure. So you can implement maybe a subset of workloads that are either failovers to the or replicated to a external data center or to Azure. Under disaster recovery, we also look at implementing things like hybrid backup and recovery for Windows Server infrastructure as a service. So setting up a recovery services vault to protect your on-premises infrastructure, so Windows servers, workloads, and either by using a backup appliance or by backing straight up into an Azure recovery services vault or backup vault. Protecting on-premises infrastructure from disasters using Azure Site Recovery. So that's the failover of certain workloads to a secondary passive location or to a different Azure region. So this takes me to my next demo, where we look at Azure Backup. So within Azure, we have, just go back there. So under backup services, we have the option for the backup center, which is a new central place, single pane of glass to manage backups, backup jobs, and vaults. We also have backup vaults to backup disks, and recovery services vaults to backup specific items. So you can go and create a recovery services vault. So this is where I can go and backup or set up backup, and where I can specify the different workloads that I want to backup. So my workloads could be running in Azure, on premises as servers, on Azure Stack appliances, or Azure Stack Hub, or HCI, and depending on what I want to backup within Azure, could be a file share, SQL Server. Selecting the on-premises option, I can specify files and folders and also specific Microsoft applications utilizing Hyper-V virtual machines or VMware virtual machines. And depending on obviously what I select, depends on what I can go and backup. So once I've specified my workload, I'll just walk through the wizard and specify a backup policy that I can create frequency, my restore points, my retention, data, and then I can go and add my virtual machines that I want to back up. And that's just as simple as selecting my virtual machines and enabling the backup, and then running through the backup job and just starting that backup. One of the other things that I can do with the recovery services vault is set up site recovery. So with site recovery, I can protect my infrastructure based against disasters, where I can use my site recovery to enable replication of virtual machines that are either running on premises, in Azure, any other Azure region. I can specify my source location, for example, West Europe. I have a subscription. I'm using the resource manager, my subscription, my resource group. And then next, I can go and specify which servers or virtual machines I want to have protected or replicate to a target region. Ideally, you'd use the region pair because that has the fastest connection. For West Europe is North Europe. And then it will go and create a resource group, virtual network, and by enabling replication or specifying a specific customizing my replication policy and settings, I can go and enable the replication. Now, a lot of times, if you utilizing site recovery and you have a lot of virtual machines that you need to replicate, it is beneficial to reserve capacity to ensure that you do have the resources available in case of a failover. So as you can see, you can utilize all of these services within the Azure Backup feature from Azure. From my virtual machines, I also have the option directly to enable things like backup, disaster recovery, and then just walk through all the options to either backup now and set up a backup job for these virtual machines. Moving to my locally installed virtual machine, I'm running Windows Server, and I have enabled Windows Admin Center on the server to connect to my Azure subscription. So one of the nice features is the Azure Hybrid Center, where I can connect my local running Windows Server with Azure and my Azure subscription for a number of different features. So this is where I can set up things like Azure Backup, etc., and connect this with my Azure tenant. Hybrid Center will give me a whole list of features that I can go and enable. So going back to my session. When looking at migration, here we're looking at core workloads that are run on Windows Server that we can migrate from on-premises to Azure. Or we can upgrade and migrate Windows infrastructure virtual machines within Azure. So there's a lot of different options. We can use Azure Migrate to lift and shift virtual machines to Azure. We can migrate storage and shares. We can also migrate specific roles and features. For example, migrate our existing domain controllers to new domain controllers from on-premises domains, virtual machines to virtual machines based in Azure. So some of the roles and features that you can go and migrate is things like Active Directory, certificate services, DHCP, DNS, remote access, IP configuration, local users and groups, etc. You can also utilize Azure Migrate to migrate IIS workloads. So IIS workloads running locally on-premise on a virtual machine and migrate that either to a web app on app services, web app in Azure, or as a containerized app on a container. When you are migrating specific roles and features, so within Windows Server, the migrate tools are built in. You just have to set them up, installing through the feature set. So the migrate server roles, you will first install the migration tools through the install feature. And then once that is installed, it will be installed into C Windows System 32 server migration tools. You would then run smig deploy.exe to create a deployment package. And you specify the path. And that will be placed into a specific folder. And then you will run the Windows Server migration tool as administrator, either from the Windows Start screen or PowerShell. So this is where you will then specify the source, a virtual machine. So what it basically does, depending on the type of workload and some of the workloads that I've mentioned, it will export the configuration of the feature or workload and target to import the feature or workload configuration on the target server. And then also it will allow you to have a cutover where the new server will take over the new role and feature set. So within this demo, going back to Azure, I also have specific roles and features, and especially when it comes to migrating data or storage, where I can set up the storage migration service locally on my Windows file server. So I can set up an orchestration server that will migrate storage in basically these 3 steps. So I basically create a job. It will evaluate and inventory size my servers. So things of like storage volumes, file shares and configuration of my file servers. Then it will copy my file shares or transfer the data from the old servers and create a cutover to the new server. So this is where it can set up a new job, and you can specify the type of devices. So you could specify Windows servers or clusters, like Linux servers or NetApp FAS, give it a name, and I'm just going to call it test job. And then basically what it does, it will step you through the wizard showing that it can migrate to service from 2012 R2 or standalone file servers, etc. And also what's not supported. You enter your credentials. This is where I can include administrative shares. And then what it will do, it will just install the required tools on the orchestrated server. And once that's done, I can go and scan devices on my network and specify the data to transfer and the target service. Going to my Azure portal, because this will take a while. I can go to Azure Migrate, and within Azure Migrate, there's tons of migration options. So I can migrate service, databases, and also web applications. So that's some of the web apps in IIS. basically you create a project and also select the different assessments. So if you will be selecting servers, migration tools, etc. I already have a project configured. There's also the different databases. So if I have running SQL, I can scan and assess my SQL servers and migrate them to Azure SQL databases, including things like my VDI that I can do. And once I have done my discovery, so it will go in Discover. I can select the type of virtualization and also target for migration and just evaluate my resources that I've already specified within my target. Just want to cancel that and go straight back to Azure Migrate. So some of the options, especially when it goes to web apps, I can now migrate web apps to a container. So within the server databases and web apps, I can migrate to a web application. So I can manage the discovered items once I've migrated my options. Just go back. And at the same time, depending on if I want to migrate data, I can create a import job within Azure where I can specify a Azure data box. If I need to migrate tons of data, a large amount of data that is not feasible to copy to an Azure storage account, I can just create a import job, or I can also export data from Azure. So basically just either create an import job or an export job, and Azure will send a data box to my location. I copy the data and the data is encrypted, and then I ship it back to Microsoft Azure. They'll connect it to my Azure region or location, and the import job will copy the data to the storage accounts that I have specified. The reverse works in the same way. It will just export the data from Azure onto a data box, and that data will be sent to my location, and then I can go and just copy the data. And the encryption keys on the data in transit, etc. So a lot of options in which you can either modernize or migrate. So it has discovery and assessment tools, and it depends whether it's physical, running on Hyper-V virtual machine, to different virtual machines or infrastructure regions on Azure. You could also use Azure Site Recovery to replicate on-premises virtual machines to Azure region, and then just do a cut over and remove the on-premises virtual machines. Lastly, looking at the next domain is monitoring and troubleshooting. Now, a lot of the core workloads running on Windows Server, whether you're running 2022, 2019, or a later version, there's tons of different ways in which to monitor Windows infrastructure as a service virtual machines. So you could monitor Windows VMs through using a performance monitor, where you can create performance baselines. And that's one of the first things that I ask my clients is, what are the workloads running on the machine? What are the, how are the resources looking? Have you done a performance baseline? When and which times or during which activities of the application or server? Do you have large CPU performance or peaks? When does the application write to disk? Does it do a lot of IOPS or heavy disk writes? Or does it do a lot of communication across the network? So you can use a lot of the default Windows Server task manager, things like process monitor and performance monitor. And within Azure, you can also utilize Azure Monitor or System Insights, where you can monitor infrastructure's virtual machines on IaaS. And there's lots of different ways in which you can go and also have a view at how busy the CPU is, the memory, and also the network on the virtual machines. So that obviously allows you to do a lot of troubleshooting. So whether you're troubleshooting on premises or things like also your Windows networks or your virtual machine, utilizing the metrics of the CPU and the disks. Through all these places, you can go and apply alerting. So checking if the CPU falls under the specific baseline that you've created, or a maximum CPU spike or disk reads, etc. And also to prevent things like excessive network communication. You can then evaluate and based on the metric enable alerting and also notification to admins or automation runbooks. Looking at on-premises and also Azure networks, there's Network Watcher. Windows Admin Center has a port scanner or network scanner built in through the Windows Admin Center portal. And also monitoring or looking at troubleshooting things like hybrid authentication issues, which falls under monitoring and troubleshooting in the advanced hybrid server infrastructure. So more looking at that in the live environment. So within Azure, I can set up monitoring. So I can just scroll down to Azure Monitor. Just look it up. And the thing with Azure Monitor is setting up a workspace. So within Azure Monitor, there's different kinds of monitoring that I can have. So this is where I can have deeper insights. So evaluation on not just virtual machines, but also my network, containers, or applications. And these are specifically based on these type of workloads. So I can detect, troubleshoot, diagnose, and have all these different dashboards that can visually show me how I can see the performance of my virtual machines or infrastructure. So based on the workloads, whether it's an application, virtual machine, storage account, containers, network, or my key vault, for example, and the other options. So within Monitor, I can set up my monitoring workspace. I can also do logging. So all the event logs, I can set up a log analytics workspace and do log forwarding to the specific workspace. I can look at specific metrics across my Azure subscription, or based on the virtual machines, I can go and evaluate a specific virtual machine. And depending on my Essentials pane in my overview, I also have some monitoring where I can look at specific metrics, for example, how busy my CPU is, my network, memory and disk, etc. So I can see if my application is functioning well. So I have those kind of metrics. Depending on my problems that I have, I can set up my insights under monitoring. If I have any boot problems with my virtual machine, I can set up diagnostics where I can look at boot diagnostics, for example, that will look at my serial log, screenshots. This is also where I can do specific diagnostic tooling. If I can't log onto my machine, I can reset the password or redeploy. I have my diagnostic setting, like I said, metrics, any alerts I can go and enable, create alerts based on specific metrics, rules, or insights. So this is where I can set up performance data and look at my disk performance, my CPU, etc. And map data across specific time zones. And the nice thing, it does show me things where I can troubleshoot based on the virtual machine, specific processes, the ports, any login events that might be running. I can also go and view this further. Going to my local machine. For all my Windows Server machines on premises through Azure Arc and through Windows Admin Center, Hybrid Center, I can set up the Azure Monitor. So I can monitor this specific server through the Azure Connected Machine Agent. So this is where I can monitor my on-premises machines in Azure the same way I would do my Azure infrastructure. So this is where I can select my Azure subscription and set it up, or through Azure Arc, which is obviously a better way. If I go back to my Azure subscription, I'm managing my server that's already connected within Azure Arc. I can specify my security extensions or my monitoring. So this is where I can get my information from the machine that's running on premises. Also looking at my logs, I can set up the log analytics and run specific queries on my virtual machine logs, looking at things like app events. And there are a bunch of default queries as well that you can go and utilize. So this is my machine that's running locally on my laptop, which is Windows Server data center that's connected to my Azure. So this is where I can enable update management, enable my logging policies, change tracking. Moving on to troubleshooting, especially looking at troubleshooting virtual networks. I can utilize my network watcher, and this is where you can, let me just type it in, network watcher. This is where I can do some network troubleshooting, and I can do specific diagnostics. So checking the flow of IP traffic, looking at my port rules and different VPN troubleshooting, packet capture, for example. So I can set up a packet capture on my network or subnet by creating that here. I can also do the same thing on my Windows server. Just gonna cancel that through packet monitoring. And this is where I can set up a capture filter based on a specific IP address, port, or MAC address, and then protocol. And it will just capture all the packets on that IP address or network address card. So a lot of options. Performance monitoring, I'm just going to exit that. Same thing, Defender for Cloud, I can troubleshoot security, etc. System insights, a lot of monitoring and troubleshooting options that I can go and install that is native in Windows Server that can tie into the Azure cloud. So just to recap, like I said, there's 5 specific domains that gets covered in the AZ-801. So you're looking at securing Windows Server on-premises virtual machines, and also Windows Server virtual machines running as infrastructure as a service on Azure in an Azure virtual network that you can go and connect either through VPNs or just by running specific Azure services, set up high availability between those servers or local on-premises servers, managing them to stay available within specific issues or problems or disasters. You can implement disaster recovery through backup or Azure Site Recovery, whether you're setting it up from Azure or within Windows Admin Center. The hybrid tools, you can migrate using Azure Migrate, different workloads, virtual machines, etc., from different platforms or on-premises virtualization platforms, where you can do storage migration services, migrate specific workloads and features using the built-in migration tools in Windows Server, and then all the different ways in which you can go and monitor your environment and virtual machines based on the built-in Windows Server monitoring tools like Performance Monitor, the different monitoring dashboards within Azure, and also the monitoring workspace for the insights and also the log analytics to forward log events. And based on all these log events, you can go and set up alerting and notifications to either do some automation through specific automation runbooks or running things like PowerShell scripts when your alert gets triggered. So some of the troubleshooting I've also shown you, Network Watcher, a lot of ways in which you can go and troubleshoot your network or diagnostics settings on the diagnostic blade option to troubleshoot startup for your virtual machines. And then also things like the Defender, where you can get recommendations. You have Azure Advisor as well. The next steps is for you to go and try it out. Have a look at the docs, Microsoft.com. On Microsoft Learn, you can have a look at the AZ-801, different domain requirements for the certification. Have a look at some of the videos that's been made available and subset of the learnings, or evaluate further, try some of the labs in the lab environment that gets added in some of the exercises, and utilize Windows Admin Center. You'll see that, and also migrate to Windows Server 2022. It's more featured to connect in a hybrid environment with Azure virtual machines. For example, you also have the Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition that's specifically made to allow you to have like some of the nice features within Azure for update management, for example, that utilizes less restarts. So that's a big deal. And contact me at MicroSpecialist or through LinkedIn if you have any questions or any feedback in the next couple of days. And that's it from me. Are there any questions?
Dag Adnan, kan je mij horen?
Ja.
Ja, we hebben jammer nog geen vragen binnengekregen, dus dan wil ik jou hartstikke bedanken voor deze leuke webinar.
Ja, graag gedaan.
En wie weet tot de volgende keer.
Tot de volgende keer. Bedankt.